Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Georgia, for sharing this time with us to talk about what we like most and to get to know the masterminds behind the stories that touch us. How are you today?
Very excited to be talking to South America.
We're happy to have you. So let's get to know our interviewee a bit more. Georgia Kaufmann was born and raised in London. She studied social anthropology and demography at Cambridge, LSE, and Oxford, but later in life, she took creative writing courses. In 2021, she published The Dressmaker of Paris, and an earlier draft titled Mirror, Mirror was shortlisted for the 2016 Bridport First Novel Prize. In December 2018, Mulberry Publishing released A Hard Fall, a political thriller set in a post-Brexit UK. Today, we will be talking about The Dressmaker of Paris. So let's go to the questions. Mercedes.
Fernando Pessoa, escritor portugués, dijo: la vida no es suficiente y por eso existe la literatura. ¿Cuáles son las razones por las que siente usted la necesidad de escribir? ¿Y desde cuándo sintió la necesidad de contar historias?
So Fernando Pessoa, a Portuguese writer, said that life is not enough and that is why literature exists. What are the reasons why you feel the need to write, and since when did you feel that need to tell stories?
Gosh, starting with Fernando Pessoa, well, he didn't think that one literature was enough either. He had about, I don't know how many personalities or signatories in his writing. So he required a multiplicity of literature and identity and personality. For me, writing, storytelling is what it's about rather than writing. So telling stories, listening to stories has always been what I love most. But it was, and I didn't really think of it as a child as being a career as such. It was just something I just spent all my time with my nose in a book reading. I was happiest. And then I started writing, but then I became an anthropologist and that took me away. But I like to think of anthropology as intellectualized gossip. And in as much as you're finding out about people, you're trying to understand people, you're trying to understand the circumstances of their lives and their motives. It's actually not that different from novel writing in some respects. And there are many anthropologists who would disagree with me about that. But in as much as what my singular focus was always to try and get inside people's minds and understand why they make the decisions they make and the circumstances they make. That would be as true for my doctoral thesis, which was on unmarried mothers in a favela in Brazil, as it would be for the decisions that Rosa makes in my book. So anthropology, novel, all the same thing, really. Just a different style of writing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. I've never thought of it, of anthropology like that.
I don't think many people would like that.
No, right?
Bien. La libertad y la igualdad de las mujeres, además de los viajes que están presentes en su novela, podríamos decir que también son dos pilares importantes en su creación literaria.
The freedom and equality of women, in addition to travel, are present in your novel. Could we say that they are two important pillars in your literary creation? So freedom and equality of women as well as travel?
The travel is an aspect of the story that wasn't intentional. It's just where Rosa went. So when I write, the character dominates what happens. So that's just where she went. But obviously it comes from my subconscious, and I'm fairly well traveled, and these are places I have lived in and been. And so, you know, my subconscious threw them out. But it was very intentional to write about a strong woman, and a strong woman who was having to use its strength at a time that was just a little bit before women's liberation, a little bit before feminism, a little bit before the pill. So all these things that young women today take for granted, but our mothers and grandmothers couldn't take for granted. I was interested in that movement, and that's why I set it then rather than now.
Interesting.
The struggle of women then was very different.
Definitely, yeah, and it's important to be aware of that.
Bien. Georgia, ¿cree que es necesario viajar para describir un lugar de una manera que transporte al lector?
So speaking of traveling, and as you just mentioned, you lived pretty much everywhere. Do you think it's necessary to travel to describe a place in a way that transports the reader?
It's really, really difficult in the modern world. So Brazil, I know well. I lived there for nearly 2 years. I lived in Brussels, but that's not in the book. The South Tyrol is obviously where I spent most of my life going backwards and forwards to, because that's where my mother comes from. America I lived in as well, but I have never lived in Paris. And I did, terrible confession, a lot of the research for Paris on Google. On Google Maps. On Google Maps, you can walk down a street. On Google Earth, you can walk down the street. You can see the street. And I actually went back to Paris last year after COVID and the pandemic just to check out that I wasn't imagining it all. I got it more or less right. So I would say, yes, it's more authentic if you've been. Let's say this. And I, I think it'd be hard as a writer not to have that sense of confidence. But on the other hand, anyone writing historical fiction, anyone writing sci-fi, they're imagining it anyway. And for me, the joy of storytelling and writing is that you can write outside your own experience. And it's been an issue that sometimes male writers are given the permission to write outside their experience, and women writers aren't. Women writers are meant to write only about what they know, because we have no imagination and we're not very good. So we have to keep our ambitions small. So whereas I feel more confidence and more authenticity in writing about Brazil and South Tyrol than I do about Paris, but I can imagine, and we have to just accept that novels aren't reality. They are an act of imagination. Going back to Fernando Pessoa, he could be a multitude of persons, and that was completely acceptable. And when you write a novel, you step into the mind of other people, and they're not real, they're imagined.
Yeah, it's true. Well, you did a good job we all thought you had been to Paris.
Got you. I've been, but just not lived.
Okay.
I've been to Paris quite a few. When I lived in Brussels, I used to go to Paris all the time, but I've never lived there. I don't know it with the same way I know the other places I wrote about.
Well, you tricked us.
Yeah. It's Borges and ficciones. So it's all fictions. If you think what Borges wrote without seeing anything and what he described, he never saw any of it.
Yeah, it's true.
Bien, justamente el escenario histórico que estamos hablando y la combinación de personajes reales con los ficticios están presentes en La modista de París. ¿Cómo suele ser la documentación? Y esta sí le lleva mucho tiempo.
So the historical setting, as we were just talking, and the combination of real and fictional characters are present in The Dressmaker of Paris. And you told us a little bit about Google Maps and stuff, but what is your research process like?
So most of the stuff in Brazil, I knew. If I show you my bookshelf, that's nearly all Brazilian literature and Brazilian stuff. So that's from my PhD. It's mainly Brazil. So South Tyrol, ironically, South Tyrol, although it's where my mum comes from, I had to actually do research because I didn't know. When you grow up somewhere, you don't necessarily learn about it historically with facts. And so I had to do research there. And Google, France, I've told you, it was a lot of Googling. I think, I'm writing a book now which is completely different. It's historical fiction. It's set in Italy and in London, in England, in the 1630s, completely different. And I'm just spending a lot of time in libraries, which I haven't done for 20 years. I'm really struggling.
It's hard to go back to the traditional.
I prefer the kind of going around and looking at churches to sitting in libraries reading books.
Bien. Rosa, el personaje central de su novela, es un personaje fascinante, es una mujer que brilla, pero tiene muchas sombras en su vida. ¿Cómo se desarrolló este personaje? ¿Se inspiró en alguien?
So Rosa, the protagonist of the novel, is certainly a fascinating character. She is a woman who shines, but at the same time, she has many shadows in her life. And how did you come up with this character? Was she inspired by anyone? Where is she coming from?
The imagination subconscious is like a soup. Everything gets thrown into it. And some different writers use different modes of extraction. the first bit of her story that I wrote, which I didn't use in the book and I threw away and I kept for a long time, was semi-pornographic. And she was quite an unpleasant old woman in New York who had a .com Chinese boyfriend 30 years younger than her, and she was just a complete power maniac. And she evolved over time into what she became, and her story emerged over time. I had no idea where the book was going until I wrote the final chapter. I didn't know whether or not it would ever end that way until I actually wrote it. So where it comes from, the elements of the story clearly come from my life. The places she went are from my life. There are the very first chapter, Stone, where she picks up a stone and hits the bully. The original version of that chapter, because I wanted in that chapter to show that she was strong even as a child. And the original chapter formulation was that she was assaulted by the local Catholic priest. And then she tried to deal with it in her own way. And I got rid of that because being assaulted by Catholic priests is kind of, well, it happens all the time. So it's a cliche now. So I didn't use that. But that incident was based on what happened to my grandmother in the mountains. My grandmother was assaulted by a Catholic priest when she was sitting on his lap learning catechism. And she told all the family, and the family, no one believed her. So that was based on a story, but it got thrown out. So there were elements that came from my life, my mother's life, my grandmother's. My mother went to Paris before she met my father in England. She was in Paris learning French. So the kind of trajectory of South Tyrol, Paris, Brazil is sort of my grandmother, my mother, and me, but it's not any of us. And as you can see, I don't wear makeup. I'm not well dressed. My family think it's a complete joke that I could ever write anything about fashion. This has been the greatest aspect of fantasy of the whole piece.
The power of imagination, right?
Yeah, totally. I have bought some red Dior lipstick. I mean, that much I.
Yeah.
Ok. La modista de París es una historia compleja con idas y venidas entre el pasado y el presente y, como ya hemos dicho, varios personajes. ¿Qué fue lo más difícil o lo más complicado que le costó desarrollar en la novela?
The Dressmaker of Paris is a complex story, definitely, with comings and goings between the past and the present and many characters. What was the creative process like? Was there anything in particular that was most difficult for you to develop?
I struggled with the beginning and the end. And the one issue that I really struggled with was ma chère. Was she talking to herself or was she talking to someone? And once I decided that I'm not going to do a reveal just in case someone watches this without having read the book, but once you know who ma chère is or what she is, I then had to decide whether to use that all the way through the book or not, or make it more obvious or keep it hidden. And I think structure, because the book is so much about the structure of the book as well, that was what really, really bothered me. Would that actually become part of the story? And so I actually wrote a different end and beginning, which is framed in the present with an encounter with ma chère at the beginning and the end. So the whole thing is framed by ma chère rather than by the phone call at the end. But it didn't really work. But that was the one thing I really struggled with. But for the rest of it, I have a technique. When my children were little and I used to tell them bedtime stories, they used to say 3 words. And I would have to tell a story based on the 3 words. And it's just a way of releasing the subconscious. And so for me, all I ever did was just choose the object, cotton wool, stone, lipstick, whatever. And then the story would just happen. And I think it's completely immaterial what that whatever that was. It was just a way of kicking the imagination. And Rosa had such a strong character that it kind of, I sound mad, but it was like taking dictation. She wrote her own story. I didn't need to know where she was going.
I think it's the first time we've heard any writers say to have that kind of process, like choosing a word or something in particular and focusing on that. That's pretty unusual.
It does. I mean, I've been on courses, creative writing courses. In Harvard, I went to a course which was just about unlocking the subconscious, and every week we were taught a different technique. And I think that was one of the techniques, maybe. But sometimes it was music, sometimes it was a color, and sometimes it was a picture. But for whatever reason, that works for me.
Yeah, if it works.
El nombre de los capítulos es muy original. La píldora, la aspirina, espejos. ¿Hay algún mensaje detrás de esas elecciones?
And I think this question may be related to what you were just mentioning. So you chose quite original chapter titles. Is there a message behind those choices, or does it have to do with this process, this writing process that you mentioned?
It really was. I literally would sit there and think, okay, what's in a bathroom cabinet? And I mean, there were some which kind of, aspirin. I can't imagine aspirin being anywhere other than that chapter. So there are some things which are very, very specific, but nail varnish or lipstick, they really could have been used anywhere. So
no hidden message.
I think it was completely random.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
I was very, very, very controlled.
It was
I knew
very thoughtful. Yeah. It was...
¿Lee a otros autores mientras trabajas en una novela? Y si es así, ¿influye lo que lee en lo que escribe?
Do you read other authors while you're working on a novel? And if so, does it influence what you're writing?
So I read a lot. Well, the last 2 years I've been watching a lot of Korean drama and I haven't been reading very much, but that's very bad for me. But normally I read all the time and I read a lot. And for the last couple of years, I've been working my way through, you can see here, this is Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and Proust. And I've been reading all that quite seriously for the last 5 years. And yes, it does influence me, because when you read really good writers, you it infuses you with a kind of, it changes the way you write. And if anything, it loosens you up. So I do try and read widely. And I don't read romantic fiction, which is strange, but I read a lot of sci-fi. So how I ended up writing romantic fiction when I read sci-fi, who knows?
It's just your subconscious again.
Yeah, I have no responsibility
We'll
for
never
it.
know.
Mark Twain dijo que para que una novela tenga éxito debería tener un enigma, un romance y una muerte. ¿Está de acuerdo con esta mezcla de elementos?
So speaking of great writers, Mark Twain said that for a novel to be successful, it should have a riddle, a romance, and a death. Do you agree with this mix of elements?
Also, well, riddle, who is my share? You have a romance or two, and we definitely have a death. So, I mean, I've never heard that one. That's great. I was just thinking also about the kind of the whole South American component of the book, whereas I don't reference any Brazilian writers. When I was growing up, I loved Isabel Allende.
Mercedes is a big fan of Isabel.
Yeah, well, I totally loved it. I have a problem with her later books.
Yeah.
But also Garcia Marquez and the whole magical realism bit, which people don't write in that style anymore, but what it brings with there is a notion which I find in literature very disturbing, which is that great literature, certainly in the English-speaking world now, doesn't have to have story. It has to have words, and the words have to be well placed and they have to be careful. But story is a kind of feminine thing, and you don't, if you've got a strong character, strong story, it's not literature, it's then commercial fiction. And I really, really object to that, because I think the most powerful writers are the ones who can write beautifully, who have got depth of feeling, and then they also have story, and they talk about complex things. And I think Allende is a very good example of Garcia Marquez. They're not frightened of story in the way that the Anglo writers are now, certainly the English writers. And that's something which I really respect.
Bien, antes de finalizar, nos gustaría saber si ya está trabajando en un nuevo libro y si podría darnos alguna pista o algún, más o menos, sobre qué va ese libro.
Okay, to wrap up, we would like to know if you are already working on a new book. You mentioned something there about Italy and London. And if you could give us some hints about what the story will be.
No,
That's our hint.
Okay, it's the same story, coincidentally. It's an Italian painter from the Baroque, but I'm writing a novel about her life. But she has the same story. She came from Italy, she conquered the world, she was brilliant in a time when women couldn't be brilliant. But she's real, and she was an amazing painter. And I just learned in the library last week that she started off by doing embroidery, just like Rosa, so I'm very excited by that. But I'm trying to write a novel based on absolute facts. So it's very different for me because it's not about my imagination running away. It's about goalposts and moving between the goalposts, but then still focusing on the motivations, the relationships, the emotional events that people are life rather than the facts.
All right. Okay. So it will be strictly historical. You will stick to reality. If your subconscious lets you.
There is no reality. You have a few documents and the rest is all embroidery.
True. Okay, we are looking forward to that.
Well, a year or two.
Sí.
Georgia, como ya estamos llegando al final de la entrevista, que siempre pasa muy rápido, nos gustaría que le dejara un mensaje a todos sus lectores y también a aquellos que van a ver esta entrevista más adelante y la van a conocer por primera vez.
So we are getting to the end of the interview, which flew by, and we'd like you to leave a message to your readers and also to all the people who haven't read your books yet, but might.
It's difficult. Well, to my readers, I hope I made you cry. That's my real ambition. If I got a few tears out of you, that means I touched your heart, and that's really what I want to do. And I hope you enjoyed reading it to the end. And to future readers, that's really your job. I can't tell them. I hate selling myself.
It's difficult.
I have tried to tell a story about a strong woman in a difficult world, doing her very, very best, and somehow or other succeeding with some mistakes along the way. But it's kind of, it's the power of women through time, I think. And romance.
Well said. Yeah, well said.
Bien, gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Si les gustó la entrevista, no olviden darle like y suscribirse al canal, activar la campanita para no perderse las futuras entrevistas. Georgia, thank you for sharing this time with us.